Recovering from Shame Through the 12 Steps. For a free catalog listing more than 1,000 pamphlets, books, audio and videotapes, and films for people interested in chemical dependency and related issues, please call 800-328-9000. In Minnesota, call 800-257-0070. And now, Recovering from Shame Through the 12 Steps with Mick Hunter.
Well, the goal of my talk today is to kind of turbocharge your program. I've been thinking about this for about 10 years, and the things that I'm going to tell you are the things that I tell my clients when I refer them to a 12-step group, if they've never been in a 12-step group, or if they've been in a 12-step group for a long time, but they're just like something is missing. I really think that 12-step groups are a revolution in psychology, and that 12-step groups were treating shame before we knew what shame was. So some of you are probably in some 12-step groups that have adapted the 12 steps of AA, so you might want to have a copy of that available so you can go through those. But I think that by the end of this hour, hopefully, you will be empowered in your program, and that things will be just much easier for you. How I got started thinking about this is I was trying to figure out what is it about the 12-step program that works with all different kinds of people. I mean, I was in Japan, and they have 12-step groups there, and they work. They've changed God to Buddha in some of the groups, but that doesn't seem to make much difference. And one time I was doing a retreat, and originally the plan was we were going to have a group for compulsive overeaters, and a group for codependents, and a group for sex addicts, and compulsive spenders, and drug addicts, and everything, and not enough people showed up. And so we were going to cancel it. And what somebody suggested was, what if you threw us all in together? And my professional training said, well, that won't work because you won't relate to each other. And they said, well, it's our money. We're going to do what we want to do. Okay? So we got in there, and I was the most nervous person. And this woman started out, and she said, well, I really don't think I fit in this group because I'm sure that I'm much sicker than the rest of you. I said, well, really, what leads you to believe that? She said, well, I do something that no one else in this room does. Well, tell us about it. Well, she said, I will eat a half a chocolate cake, and then I'll take the other half and I'll throw it in the garbage, and I'll take out the garbage in the alley, and I'll swear never to eat chocolate cake again. And in the middle of the night, I'll get up and I'll go out in my nightgown and I'll eat that chocolate cake in the alley and out of the garbage can. And she said, I bet no one else in this room has ever done that. And I thought, damn, I wish we had some other compulsive overeaters because they could say yes, but we didn't. So there was this long silence, and she said, see, I'm the sickest one. And maybe I should just leave. And then the guy said, wait a minute, I've never done that, but I used to take pliers and bend my needles and throw them in the garbage disposal, and then in the middle of the night I'd dig them out, straighten them out, and shoot up again. That sounds about the same. And then a minute later another guy said, no, wait, I used to rip up my pornography in little tiny pieces, and in the middle of the night I'd dig it out, and I'd reassemble it like a giant jigsaw puzzle and tape it all back together and masturbate to it. And one by one, everyone went around the circle, and everyone had a story just like that. So I was trying to figure out what's the common thread in addiction and in 12-step groups, and what I think it is, it's a shame treatment program. So I'm going to talk about what shame is and how the 12 steps cope with it. I mean, we've known for a long time that there's more to stopping a compulsive behavior than just stopping the behavior, because there's all kinds of thoughts and feelings. And AA talks about there's more to it than putting the plug in the jug. Other people talk about switching addictions. You know, you go to a meeting and somebody gets up and they says, I'm so grateful to AA because now I haven't had a drink for 3 months. And then they come back for their 6-month medallion and they weigh 400 pounds. And they say, then they come back for their year medallion, they say, I'm so grateful to AA because I haven't had a drink now in a year, and I'm so grateful to OA because now, you know, I've stabilized my weight, and they have 4 cigarettes in their mouth as they're saying it. Okay? So new behavior, same results. You know, and I actually have clients that are in 7 different 12-step groups. If there was an 8th day, they would take on a new group. We've also got people that stop the behavior, but you wish they'd go back to it. Dry drunks, right? People that just, I prayed for you last night. Really? Yeah, I prayed you'd have a slip so you'd be a little more tolerable. Okay? What a dry drunk is somebody who stopped the behavior but hasn't treated the shame. They still have all the character defects. Now, I believe in this because I know that addiction is more than physical. Nicotine is one of the most addictive substances we know of. But I stopped smoking, and I went through about a week where I was pretty miserable to be around. But a year later, I was on a television show, and we took a break, and I thought I was pretty relaxed, except I walked off the stage, and a perfect stranger lit a cigarette up, and I grabbed it out of his face and started smoking it. Okay? That's not physical addiction. That's psychological addiction. I was terrified, and I knew that that would medicate my fear. Now, if you have a lot of shame, of course, you're going to have a lot of fear because you're going to be worried that people are going to see it. The problem statement of adult children of alcoholics contains this phrase, we judge ourselves harshly, and we have a very low sense of self-worth. What they're talking about there is shame. So let's talk about exactly what shame is. Shame is when you think that those around you have finally figured out what a worthless person you are. You're ashamed of yourself, your personhood, who you are, your core, your identity. There's a burning in your face. You hate to look anyone in the eye. Time seems to drag on forever. You start calling yourself names. I'm such a, fill in the blank. And there's a sense of hopelessness and helplessness that people can see into you and you can't do anything to prevent it. Does that sound familiar to anybody in here besides me? Okay. So where does this shame come from? It's taught in significant relationships. So let's spy in on this family. Let's say it's Thanksgiving in this shame-based family. And this little girl reaches to get the salt and she spills her milk. And everybody stops talking. And somebody says, "Oh, a milk spiller, huh?" They label her. Then somebody else says, "Yeah, she always spills her milk. You remember 2 years ago, Thanksgiving, she spilled her milk then, too." Then somebody says, "Well, this isn't from my side of the family. This is your side of the family where we get this." Yeah? So she's been labeled. It's gotten global, and it's not just a behavior anymore. It's her identity. So she cleans up the milk, but she doesn't look at anybody. And it doesn't do any good to apologize for being a milk spiller because she always spills her milk. And then they pour her half a glass of milk because she's a milk spiller and she always spills her milk. Okay, and then 15, 20, 30 years later, she's having Thanksgiving dinner. And what does her kid do? Spills the milk. And she says, "Yeah, I knew it was genetic." Okay? How could a milk spiller not have a milk spiller for a kid? Okay? Now, the trouble with shame is that it becomes self-triggering. That once somebody teaches you how to be shameful, you don't need them anymore. You can do it yourself. Now, shame is triggered anytime the self is paid attention to. So even when you get positive attention, they're paying attention to yourself, and you start to get shameful. Anybody in here have trouble taking compliments? Okay, that's a shame response. It's something like you say, "Oh, I like your saxophone pin," and I get shameful because I'm afraid if you're noticing that, the next thing you're going to do is notice something else about me and something else, and eventually you're going to get to the big truth, which is I'm worthless and no good and an imposter. So when I had an excess of shame, what I would do is change the subject or get it off on you or do some little song and dance to get away from you. So one of the things it doesn't do when you're working with somebody who's shameful is to tell them that they're good. Because if you have the power to tell them you're good, you have the power to tell them that you're bad. So you can't argue someone out of their shame. it ends up making you look foolish because they're sitting there thinking, what do you know? You can't even recognize a worthless person when you see one. Or the other response that people have is they get shameful about being shameful. See? You go out and read a booklet on shame and you say, oh, I shouldn't feel shameful. And then when you get shameful, you said, oh, now I feel bad about being shameful. It's a cycle. It builds on itself. Now, one of the things that having a word for shame helps is it makes it less powerful because you have a name for it now. And as soon as you get the idea that shame is a lie, it's not the truth, right away it takes some of the power away from it. As soon as when you're experiencing shame and you can say, oh, this is shame, this isn't the truth, it isn't quite so powerful. Now that's a problem if you adhere too rigidly to the disease model of alcoholism, is because if you think it's just a biological problem, just an allergy to drugs, you won't pay attention to the shame. And I think you have to really pay attention to that. If all we needed was to get rid of the physical addiction, all you'd really need is the first step. You'd say, I can't use this stuff anymore. But what about all those 11 steps? The other 11, that's what treats the shame. So what the 12-step program does is provides a framework and a support system to help a person change his shame-bound identity into a guilt-based identity. Okay? Now, a lot of people confuse guilt with shame. A lot of people think that shame is just industrial strength guilt. They're two separate things. So if you go to meetings and you see those bumper stickers that say screw guilt on it, they don't get it. You don't want to get rid of guilt. Guilt is what usually gets you into a recovery program because you think the behavior you're doing is bad and you don't want to keep doing it anymore. Guilt is a good thing. Shame is the problem. So maybe we better talk about what guilt is here. Okay, guilt is a consciousness of knowing what right and wrong is and that you have impact on others. Without guilt, you can't be empathic to others, and that it tells you that you have a value system. So you certainly wouldn't want to get rid of being empathic, having values and awareness of right and wrong. And where does guilt come from? It comes from the same place that shame comes from, is you're taught that. Right? Remember when you taught some kid about sharing? Part of what you were doing was teaching them about guilt, that it's not okay to reach over and take something from somebody else and poke them in the eye, because they're people too, and it hurts them. So let's go to another house on Thanksgiving. And this is a guilt-based house. And this little girl reaches for the salt and she spills her milk, and people stop talking and they say, you spilled your milk. That's about a behavior, not about being a person. And we don't like it when people spill their milk because it's disruptive to the party, it's messy, and it wastes food. And those are all bad things that we try to not do. And so you can make up for this by cleaning up the milk. And so the kid gets up and cleans up the milk and looks at everyone in the eye and says, I'm sorry I disrupted the party and that I wasted food and spilled the milk. They just learned 3 values. They also learned that when you screw up, when you make a mistake, there's a way back. You can reform the relationship. So then they say, that's okay, be more careful, and they pour them another glass of milk. And then they never bring it up again because it's done with. The next time she spills her milk, they don't say, you spilled your milk 2 years ago too, because that's a done deal. So when her kid spills her milk, it's not going to be a very big deal because it's just going to be spilled milk. And it's not going to be whether she's a good mother or not. So let's look at the difference between how shame and guilt impact people's lives. A lot of people believe that if you shame somebody enough, you can control their behavior. They think that's a treatment for something. I don't think it works. Shame is about being a bad person, having a bad self, whereas guilt is about a bad behavior, something that you do or don't do. When you're shameful, you judge yourself harshly. When you're guilty, you assess your behavior accurately. Shameful people are grandiose, They make a mistake and they think that they've destroyed somebody's life. They think it's the worst thing that's ever happened and they can never be forgiven for it. I have a rule, which is that I don't say anything to myself that I wouldn't say to somebody that I love. So if my wife made a mistake, I wouldn't say, "Boy, are you stupid and doomed." But I would say that to myself in the old days. Worse, things that I can't say on tape. Okay? When you're shameful, you want to avoid others because you don't want anybody to see that you're a bad person. When you're guilty, you want to seek out those that you've harmed and make amends. You want to fix the relationship. When you're in shame, there's time distortion. When you're guilty, it's real time. I remember one time I was telling part of my story when I was doing a lecture, and I didn't say it was part of my story, and somebody laughed at a very painful part of my story, and I got shameful. And I went silent, which I thought it was for about 10 minutes. And I wanted to leave the stage, but I figured it was so far I'd have to pack a lunch to get there. There was distance distortion, too. Okay? It was on tape. It lasted, I actually was silent for about 3 seconds. But because I thought everyone had suddenly recognized me as a bad person, and they were all sitting there thinking, why are we sitting here listening to this bozo? Time got distorted. When you're shameful, there's name-calling. When you're guilty, there's self-acceptance. Yep, I made a mistake. I wish I'd done it differently. Shame results in isolation, guilt in amended relationships. Shame in self-hatred. Guilt is self-forgiveness. Shame is a shame spiral. It gets worse and worse, and it just snowballs and builds. When you feel guilty and you make amends, then you end up feeling proud. When you're shameful, there's hopelessness. You don't think anything can ever make it any better. When you feel guilty and take care of it, there's hope that things can always be repaired. With shame, there's helplessness. I can't do anything about this. I'll have to be this way forever. With guilt, there's a sense of competence. Shame leads to self-destructive behavior and thoughts. That's why you can't shame somebody out of an addiction. You'll just make it worse. Guilt leads to self-nurturing behaviors and thoughts. You take care of yourself because you're a worthwhile person. So let's just go through each of the 12 steps and talk about how they can do this. How can they be so powerful as to change an identity? The first word of the first step tells you that. And when I have someone who's been attending a 12-step group for some time and isn't making it, isn't getting it, I always say, tell me what the first step is. And they say, admitted we were, stop, I know what the problem is. They miss the most important word, we. Because they're trying to do a solo plan. But shame comes from abusive or neglectful relationships, and so in order to heal that, you have to have accepting, nurturing relationships. You have to have a we. It's a mutual help program. And one of the things that you get in a mutual help program is that you get a sponsor, and a sponsor is somebody who says to you, you matter to me. Well, that's the beginning of getting rid of shame. Another nice word in this is powerlessness. It tells you that you didn't have a choice to behave the way you did in the past. It's not because you were a bad person, it was because of your powerlessness. Now, if your powerlessness, of course, that's going to lead to unmanageability. And in shame-based families, there are always double binds, which means no matter what you do, you're in trouble. Okay? Like, sex is dirty and disgusting. Save it till you love someone. Okay? That's a double bind, right? I was working with a client. He's going out with this woman, and I said, is there any chance that you'll be sexual? Because I wanted to talk about that. It's a pretty loaded thing for a recovering person. He says, oh, we're not in a meaningful relationship yet, so I couldn't possibly degrade and humiliate her in that way. Because that's the way he thought about it. You know, I respect you too much to have sex with you now. Later on, I won't respect you, and then we can have sex. That's a double bind. So one of the ways that we get rid of that is the ritual introduction. You know, hello, my name is Mick and I'm and then instead of all of you standing up and running from the room screaming, you say my name and say hello. You say, we're going to stick around. I'm going to say the worst possible thing I can think of. I mean, you can always tell somebody who's new in a meeting how they choke on that I'm because they think of it as a bad thing, about their being bad people. The other part of that is telling your story, is that you say all of those things about you that you're convinced prove that you're a bad person, and people not only don't leave, but they come up afterwards and shake your hand and slap you on the back and say thanks, that was really helpful. Your terminal uniqueness is lessened. That's the isolation of shame. So then you can move on to step 2. What this tells you is that your shame-bound identity is an abnormal state that was inflicted on you and is not your true self. See, it says, restore us to sanity. Restore means you were once there. It's not something new you have to learn. Plus, it promises that there's a power greater than ourselves. And a lot of people will balk at this right away and say, well, I don't believe in such a thing. And I ask them to describe a shame response, and they talk about this sense of being overwhelmed and that they can't do anything about it and that it's wrecked their lives. And I say, oh, well, that sounds like a power greater than yourself. When you were little, did you say, when I grow up, I want to hate myself and be involved in self-destructive behaviors? No, you didn't. You didn't choose this. Okay? So if shame is a power greater than you, is there a possibility that there's a healing power greater than you? I think that just makes sense, of course. If there's one, there's probably another. So that leads us to step 3. As I said before, to heal shame, healing relationships are required, nurturing, supportive, kind relationships. And what this is telling you is that you can have a trusting relationship with a God, with a higher power. Shame teaches you that you're unworthy of any quality relationships. Now, often, the reason that people have problems with step 3 is that they're afraid to turn their will and their life over because they confuse their parents and their concept of God. Okay? So if I said, boy, I have a great show and tell for you, we're just going to step outside here for a minute. I have a being that's 50 times bigger than all of you, can make light appear and disappear, can transport you great distances, can supply food or take it away, and can kill you. You'd say, oh, you brought God. I'd say, no, I brought your parents when you were an infant. You don't learn about God in a mosque or a temple or a church. You've already figured out God laying on your back, staring up at that little mobile when those big beans come down. And if they're kind and nurturing and supportive, and then someone tells you about God, you go, well, that sounds like a good deal. But if they're frightening and abusive and neglectful and shaming, and they swoop down on you, and somebody says, guess what, there's this great all-powerful Father in the sky, you'll say, no thanks, not interested. Oftentimes I'll have people, because 80% of the people in America say they view God as a he, I'll say, tell me a little bit about your father. People who are having spiritual problems. And then later on in the therapy hour, I'll say, tell me a little bit about your concept of God. And it's exactly the same. And they never thought about it that way. Shame is about isolation, but spirituality can heal that because it's about a sense of wholeness and connectedness. Right? I mean, think about the spiritual awakening you've had. Times you've been like out in the woods and suddenly you just felt like you were just part of it all. That's spirituality. That's being connected. 12-step groups use that because they use ritualized touch. At the beginning or the end of a meeting, you hold hands and you're one. That sense of isolation is reduced. Plus, in healthy 12-step groups, there's a lot of processing of the relationships. People talk about the impact that they're having on each other. That's very bonding too. That gets rid of a lot of shame. Step 4, And this is usually the place where people stop working the steps. Okay, I've got a problem. I believe there's something that can be done about it. I'd like to get some help, but. It's like the person who said, I'd do anything to have a body like that except exercise and diet. So step 4 is you're starting to improve your relationship with yourself. You're answering the question, who am I? The problem statement of adult children of alcoholics says, we have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, and it is easier for us to be concerned with others rather than ourselves. This enables us not to look too closely at our faults or our responsibility to ourselves. That screams for a 4th step. Okay? Now, when I worked in treatment, I used to see people like crawl out of a 5th step. And I thought that it was supposed to be like the Inquisition or something, that you went in there and you had all of your badness flogged out of you somehow. Okay? So I had a really hard time trying to convince people that they couldn't leave treatment until they had done a 4th and a 5th step. But then somebody helped me out that they said that a 4th step is that where you look at your negative acts due to positive goals misdirected. Okay? What that means is you did bad things, but you meant well. Okay? So let's take drinking too much. How many people in here drank to be accepted? Okay? Is there anything wrong with wanting to be accepted? No. I would want that for you. Now, is there anything wrong with drinking a quart and throwing up on people to be accepted? Yes, it doesn't work. I have yet to see a personal ad that says, single white female seeks vomiting male for intimate relationship. You probably would get answers for that if you put it in, but remember, I'm a marriage and family therapist, so you're going to need me. So the trick here in the 4th step is to say, how did my shame get in the way of my positive goals? How did I overdo it or underdo it? That's all it's asking. It's just not that big a deal. It's not turn over your personal rocks and look for the scum underneath it. That's a shame thought, that you think that that's what the 4th step is. Okay, now step 5 asks you to put this belief system of the first 4 steps into action. Okay? You're telling yourself that you're not this horrible person that you thought you were. Go in a room with somebody and tell them really who you are. If you really aren't this horrible person, go ahead and try it. And the first time I did a 5th step, I was disappointed. I did it with this old priest, and he sat and looked out the window the whole time. And which I'm glad he did, because if he had looked at me, I would have been afraid that he could have seen that I was a horrible person. He knew what he was doing. And I got all done, and he wasn't impressed. See, I thought I was going to have these he would have, I thought, I picked this old guy because I figured, he's heard it all. Okay? He was not impressed. See, I had that shame grandiosity that I was the worst and that I was going to be kind of the peak of his career. Okay? See, I didn't want any young person because I might scare him off from doing 5th steps with anybody. Okay, so then step 6. This is a great promise. It's saying that your shame can be removed, which is one of the things that shame tells you is not true. Shame wants you to believe that it's this way forever. This is your core. Now, one of the things that you can ask to be removed is your shame itself. That sounds like a character defect to me. Believing that you're flawed to the core, that sounds to me like a character defect. That sounds to me like something that you ought to have removed. That you ought to ask specifically, to have your shame removed, that it's not useful in the doses that you have. Now, for a lot of people, this is frightening because their identity is about being a bad person, and if I'm not a bad person, then who am I? I've seen people in group fight to be the worst person because they figure they don't have any chance of being just a regular person, so they might as well have some identity, and it's going to be as a bad example. Okay? So I saw a guy say, well, I'm the worst in the group because I did this certain thing. And somebody said, well, I did that too. And this guy, oh no, now what am I going to do? And he said, yeah, but I liked it. Okay, you win, you're the worst. That's what junkie pride is, right? Oh, yeah, sure you did that, but I did this drug and that's way worse, or I spilled more on my tie than you drank in your whole life and everything. Show me somebody who's grandiose and I'll show you somebody who's shameful. We're entirely ready, that phrase really gets at the perfectionism in people. But then again, perfectionism is a sign of shame. If I just do it perfectly, no one will realize what a horrible person I am. And then, of course, you can't do it perfectly because you're a human being, and that just proves that you're worthless. So now you have two things you can ask to be removed. One is your shame, and the other is your perfectionism. Now, remember in that fourth step, we talked about the negative acts due to positive goals misdirected. Step 6 is just about your defects are merely desirable traits taken to extremes. So recovery is about gaining moderation and balance in life. And you can watch this, people in recovery that go from one extreme to the other. And I warn people when I send them to adult children of alcoholics, I say, now in your first couple of meetings, a total stranger is going to walk up to you and say, I just need to be honest with you for a minute. And as soon as those words escape their lips, run and hide. Okay? Because what they are about to do is nail you in the name of honesty. Because they've lived in a family of dishonesty, and so they think that any thought that comes into their mind, they're going to say out loud. That's tactlessness. That's going to the other extreme. Okay? So you want to find that middle ground. So here's a continuum for you. I've got selfish at one end and selfless at the other. Right? And usually addicts are told that they're selfish, and codependents are selfless and proud of it. Right? Talk about junkie pride. And both of them need to get in the middle, which is self-respecting. So when someone has lived a pretty selfish life and they feel guilty about something that they do, that is a sign not to do that again, right? That's what guilt tells you. Don't step over this line. That's a bad thing. When someone's been selfless and they feel guilty, this is a paradox. They need to do more of it. Okay? Because they'll make a little move over towards being self-respecting, but they'll picture themselves being all the way over here as selfish. So for both people, it's finding that middle ground instead of flip-flopping back and forth between the two of them. I was working with a woman who had gotten her husband into treatment 15 times or something, and she had never bothered to go to Al-Anon or family programs or therapy or anything like that, because she was busy being selfless. Well, all of a sudden, she had a codependent rage attack in my office, and she leaped up on my coffee table and was stomping her feet, screaming, "What about me? What about me? What about me?" 20 years of selflessness finally coming out in a selfish attack. I said, well, number one, get off my coffee table. We will start now working on self-respect. Okay? So anytime I have someone do a fourth or fifth step or sixth or seven, I have them write out continuums. See, people like to do all or nothing, honest, dishonest. Boy, is that addict thinking, huh? You always need to have 3 points on the continuum. Okay, so here we go. We're moving along to step 7. People from addictive systems tend to think, feel, and behave in extremes. So humility is a difficult concept. People confuse that with humiliation, which fits right in with shame. But humility is understanding that you are a worthwhile person, period. Not compared to anybody. That's a shame response. If you go into a party and you say, oh, I guess I'm pretty after all because none of the rest of these people are, well, that can be wrecked pretty quick, right? Just one pretty person has to walk in, okay? But I can say, I am intelligent, period. You can be intelligent too. This isn't a contest. There's enough intelligence to go around. Okay? So humble people are not intimidated by other people's qualities because it's not a competition. Humility is that middle ground between grandiosity and intense shame. Grandiosity is merely a shameful person's attempt to be reassured that he or she is really an acceptable person. And I've been making reference to junkie pride. Other people call it false pride. Another thing is shamelessness. Right? You're with somebody who really ought to be ashamed of what they're doing and they're not. But then you feel it? Because somebody's going to. Okay. One of the signs of humility is the ability to laugh at yourself and your actions. And now about, not at. When you get up and hear speakers and they're just making fun of themselves, I don't know about you, but I get really uncomfortable because I'm not going to laugh with them, at them. I'll laugh about what happened. So healthy laughter is common in highly functional 12-step meetings. So one of the things to look at is your self-talk. What is it that you tell yourself throughout the day? There's some research that says that you talk to yourself at 300 words a minute. Self-talk. Okay? Now, if that's all about, gee, you're doing okay, way to go, you're looking pretty good, that was a nice thing to say, good move there, you would like to keep doing that, right? But if it's, oh my God, I can't believe you said that, don't look in that mirror, you look hideous enough, all of that, who needs it? I mean, imagine taking a trip to Florida from Minnesota with somebody, if you had a person riding with you that talked to you the way you talk to yourself, you'd push them out by Iowa, right? And back up to make sure you finished them off. But you do that to yourself all the time. That's about shame. What's interesting is that I will ask people to write down the names they call themselves. And then in a couple sessions later, when they won't know what I'm up to, I'll ask them to write down what their parents used to call them. And guess what? The same order even, they write them in. Remember that once someone shames you, you know how to do it yourself. You don't need their help anymore. Okay, as we move on to step 8, this is when you're asked to think about your bad behaviors. Rather than branding yourself as bad, your behaviors as bad. Now, when you label yourself as bad, this prevents you from making amends, and if you are prevented from making amends, you can't heal the relationship. That's what resentments are about. It leads to isolation and further shame. Now, notice that we're more than halfway through the 12 steps. That's because it's very difficult for shame-based people to face others and say, I made a mistake. You've got to do a lot of internal healing before you can go out and meet with others. But a lot of people don't buy that. What they do is they do a first step and then they go right away and want to make amends, which just increases their shame. Because look at how you've got step 8 prepares you for step 9. You don't even really have to do it. You just have to get ready to do it. That makes it more relaxing, easier, because you don't really have to do anything with your list. You just have to get it ready. Step 9 is amends. It doesn't just say you were sorry. Amend means to add something positive to a relationship. Step 9 is not about other people forgiving you. It's about you forgiving yourself. So it doesn't matter what they do with your amend. It doesn't matter. They can hold on to resentment, or they may have forgiven you 25 years ago. It really doesn't matter, because it's about you forgiving yourself. Letting go of that shame piece that says that you're so unforgivable and so evil that you have to hold this forever. How many people in here have ever wondered if you're evil? Okay, good. That's a good sign, because evil people never worry about that. Okay. Evil people don't feel guilty. They don't desire forgiveness. They don't even think about it. They just march through life objectifying people and using them. So if you feel guilty about doing that, you're not evil. Okay, now, if you've successfully worked steps 1 through 9, what you've done is you've taken a shame-based identity, converted it to a guilt-based identity, done something about the guilt. So now what do you need? You need a maintenance program so that you will stay that way. And that's what 10, 11, and 12 is all about. You want to stay guilt-based rather than shame-based. So you'll notice it says not if we were wrong, but when we were wrong. Of course you'll be wrong. Guilt-based people make mistakes too. Promptly admitting it means that you're less likely to dwell on the mistake and then somehow turn it into proof that you're not a good person. I can remember the date, the time, who was in the room, and what they were wearing the first time I said, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Because I was sure what would happen is I would implode or explode, or they would beat me to death or throw me out the window or something, because I was sure what I was admitting to was, I am unworthy of living. Well, now, I can say it all the time and mean it. I even got to the point where sometimes I'll say it even when I'm not sure, and then if I figure out later on that I'm not sorry, I go back and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, I wasn't sorry about that other thing. Shame-based people feel bad, and that's a code word for shame, right? When you say, I feel bad, even when they haven't done anything inappropriate. That's what codependents and adult children of alcoholics are all about. I remember working in treatment, and I said to somebody, excuse me, and he said, I'm sorry. I said, for what? And he said, well, I'm sure I've done something wrong. That was his view of himself in life, because of the shame. One of the things about getting away from the selflessness is you're only supposed to admit you were wrong when you were wrong. Okay? Codependents like to be wrong for everybody. Okay? Because then they believe they can do something about it. See, if it's my fault, then I can fix it. Okay? Even though they can't. So step 11, a shame-based identity can only exist in the absence of spirituality. Okay? It's a teeter-totter, an inverse relationship. The more spirituality you have, the less shame you can have. They don't go together. Spirituality is a sense of being part of something bigger and somehow connected, where shame requires isolation and a belief in your uniqueness. Now, step 11 is important because a lot of people interact with God on a superficial level, like they'll only pray when they're in trouble. But really what I think this step is calling for when it says conscious contact is a personal relationship with God. Okay? Now just imagine if you were going to have a relationship with your sponsor and you were pretty nervous about interacting with authority figures, which is what a sponsor is supposed to be, somebody who's one up Not because they're better than you, but because they have more experience than you. So the first time you call your sponsor up and you say to her, well, I'm a little nervous, so I just thought I'd do this little ritualized thing. So Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. And then you go through that little nursery rhyme and you say, okay. And then you hang up. Okay? So that's okay. You know, you made the phone call, you connected a little bit. And then the next night you do the same thing, and the next night you do the same. Well, after a while it wears pretty thin. Okay? You're not getting much out of it. You can do it, you know, you can say it while you're watching television, and it doesn't mean much to anybody. But people will do that in their relationship with God. They'll call God up, that's what prayer is, and then they'll say a little ritualized prayer while they're thinking about what's for dinner or watching TV or whatever, and no one gets much out of it. Now, I like ritual. I think that's a great way to start. It gets you going. But I think it ought to be a personal relationship. And that means that you talk about your relationship with God. How is it today? Are you mad at God? You know, are you lonely? What's going on? To talk about your feelings. A woman came up to me, and I was talking about feelings at that time, how to identify and express your feelings, and she said she had a lot of trouble doing that. And she told me this horrendous story about her life, child abuse and rape and poverty and just, I mean, name a problem, she had it. And I said, without thinking, oh, you must really be angry with God. And she went, shh, shh, don't call any attention to me. I figured out that she was just completely angry with God, but terrified to have that kind of a relationship with God. So I said, well, you won't be able to get in touch with your feelings, horizontal spirituality, connecting with other people, until you can deal with your feelings about your vertical spirituality, your relationship with God. So I said, what I'd suggest you do tonight is you go out in the fields out here by Hazelden and tell God how angry you are. Well, I didn't hear from her for years and years, and I just wondered what had happened. I was a little nervous because that night there was a thunderstorm, and I imagined her out there. Waiting to get a call from an attorney. Did you or did you not, Mr. Hunter, suggest that this woman go out and scream at God during a thunderstorm? But then a few years later, I was speaking someplace else, and this woman, very attractive, confident woman, came up and she said, did you ever wonder what happened to that woman? And I said, yeah. And she said, you're looking at her. I said, so tell me what happened. She said, well, I went out and I was feeling pretty shameful. I couldn't look up or anything, and I kind of blamed you. I said, well, this guy had this weird idea about me talking about how angry I was and everything. And then it started to rain, and she said, that was perfect. That fit right in with my life. And then it started to lightning, and she said, I suddenly snapped, and she said, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I started jumping up and down saying, well, go ahead and electrocute me, but you're going to hear me out before you do. And she spent half an hour ranting and raving and stomping and screaming and cursing, and she never felt more spiritual in her life. And she said, after that, God and I had quite a few discussions, and we figured it out. And so now when I'm mad, I tell God I'm mad, and when I'm sad, and when I'm lonely, and when I'm shameful, and all of that. We get along really well now. So that's my recommendation to you about prayer and meditation with God, is to treat God like a decent person and have a decent civil conversation. So, we're running out of time and we're running out of steps. We're up to step 12. Shame is all pervasive for shame-based people. It affects everything. It affects your sexuality, your spirituality, your feelings, your relationship with money, food, everything. The nice thing is that recovery is all pervasive too, that it affects every area of your life. The last phrase here, practice these principles in all our affairs, means that you practice your new shame-free behaviors with people who are like you and people who are not like you. Because the problem with only hanging out with people who have the same problem that you have is that you go from saying, I'm so sick no one could understand me, to I'm so sick only other sick people could understand me. And remember the lesson from the beginning of the talk that I got about having everyone accept you, whether they do the same thing or not. So when you're early in recovery, it makes sense to me that you only have other recovering friends and people that are working on the same stuff that you're working on. But, you know, after 4, 5, 6 years, if the only people you're hanging out with are people who have the same problems you used to have, you're missing out on a big piece of life. And so one of the signs to me that people have really done something with their shame is that they don't have to connect with people only through their problems. I really appreciate how you've paid attention. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I hope you have a peaceful day.